The instrument that you're currently listening to I call the MIDI-lele. It's like an electronic ukulele that's made mostly out of recycled stuff. I love making freaky MIDI controllers like this one, and I love making the Kontrol Freak videos, but it's time for a conceptual reboot. I'm currently preparing for the Maker Faire Barcelona 2019, where I will be hosting a workshop in Spanish on how I make these instruments. So the next few videos after this one will address that. Hope you enjoy. Welcome to another Kontrol Freak video. In case you don't know what it is that I get up to around here, it's really pretty simple. I make MIDI instruments out of scrap materials. So I recycle, I upcycle, I improvise and invent until I end up with fully functional instruments such as this cardboard flute here, or this MIDI melodica, which has a DIY breath sensor inside that's made out of a balloon. So today's project is going to be a first for me. I'm going to try to make a MIDI string instrument. Now, keeping in mind that this is going to be a prototype, proof of concept kind of thing, I'm going to keep it as simple as possible. So first of all, that means that I'm going to make a 4-string instrument, which I can then hopefully pluck like a bass or strum like a ukulele. But also I'm going to go full on minimalist in my use of materials and components. And so I've gathered together everything that I will need for this project in this box here, so let's have a look at it. Okay, so check this out. Today's project actually has really a lot in common with the very first Kontrol Freak instrument that I ever made, which is this keyboard here. First of all, as you can probably see, they're both based off of the same kind of cardboard box, which comes from a smartphone, except that this time I actually got rid of all the brand markings. Secondly, the functionality of this new instrument is going to rely exclusively on 16 capacitive sensors being read through a multiplexer, just like I did for the original keyboard. Except that in this case, of course, I don't need to make keys for the keyboard, so I won't be needing the copper sticky tape. Instead, I'm going to make the capacitive strings out of the cables themselves. So let's have a look at the rest of it. Here we have, as always, the teensy breakout board and some female headers. Then we have some transparent sticky tape, and then we have a bunch of scrap cable that I cut out of a previous project. And so we add in some solder and my trusty soldering iron, and this is everything that we're going to need for this project. So the first thing I need to do is to mark out on the box where everything goes. Now keep in mind that we have a total of 16 sensors and we're using 4 strings. So that means that we will need 4 sensors for the strumming area of the instrument, and then we will have 3 sections of fretboard with 4 sensors in each also. So that should be enough to play a good few different chords, and certainly enough for this proof of concept here. Okay, so I'm going with the spacing of about 1 centimeter between the strings, which is pretty close to a guitar or ukulele setup. Okay, so in order to keep this more or less comfortable to play, I'm actually going to put the fretboard section in the lower part of the instrument here. Something like that. Okay, so then the length of the fretboard sections I think should be more like 2 centimeters or something like that, maybe a little bit more. Just going to mark those out like this. So this is where the frets will go, which will separate the fretboard sections, and so that should work. First of all, I'm going to solder on 8 female headers so that I can plug the multiplexer directly into the breakout board. Next up, I'm going to populate this multiplexer here with 16 individual cables, which will then turn into the sensors on the instrument. Awesome, so that's basically all of the sensors connected, because as I mentioned here, the sensors are the cables. So now what we need to do is just plug the multiplexer into the breakout board, starting on pin 2. And if you don't have my awesome breakout board, which you don't, then this is what the connections look like. So let's think about the strings for a second. Now each of these cables here is going to represent one string section. And so I need to draw each of them up through a hole at the fret, I guess, like that. And then lay it flat across that section like this, and then tape it down. And that will hopefully give me the tactile feeling of having a string there, which is then also a capacitive sensor at the same time. So I'm going to try to get these cables attached in the right order, which basically means I go from 1 to 16, would be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So that's what I'm going to try to do right now. Nice. Now for the strings. So that is the strumming or plugging section of the strings. Now I just need to tape them down to the surface, trying to make sure to make the tape conform to the shape of the strings so that I don't lose my tactile feedback here. So that's a little bit rough around the edges, but you know, it actually does feel like 4 strings on there. So I'll be able to strum those and possibly plug them as well. We shall see. Okay, so now for the main fretboard section. Okay, so I have all the strings inserted. Now I'm going to just try and tape them down. Let's see how that goes. Okay, that actually feels surprisingly convincing. So now all that's left to do is actually just put in 4 frets here, which in this case means that I'm just going to cut off 4 bits of cable, lay them down on here, and then tape those down on top. And that's it. Have a look at that. And yeah, I know that it looks really crummy, but that's the nature of the Kontrol Freak. So you can certainly see how this is going to work. I guess 3 fretboard sections here, each with 4 strings, and then of course we have our 4-string strumming and plugging section down here. So if I make this work in any kind of way, then I'll certainly be making a cooler looking version at some point in the future. But for now, all that's left for me to do here before I can plug it into the computer is to just insert a little USB cable. Let's see, I'm just gonna just pull this in through here, plug it into the TNC, and then we close the lid, and we're good to go. Let's bring this over to the computer and see if we can't make it work and make some noise. And there we go, all set. So I just made a few adjustments off camera, namely changing some of the pin numbers around, and I'll get to that in a second. But first of all, of course, we're here to check out the code for this instrument. So as is always the case, I've gone ahead and prepared all the code for the MIDI ukulele beforehand, because watching me code is probably not why you came here. I did manage to save a few files along the way so that I can show you how I made it work. So let's plug this into the computer and see how it goes. So here's the first file, and as always it's a pretty simple one. The first thing I do here is I define the necessary pins for the multiplexer. This time it's a little bit different, because instead of the ground pin and 3-volt pins on the microcontroller, I have pulled ground and 3 volts from some of the digital pins, which just made it easier to plug the multiplexer in. So then in the setup, I also set the pin mode on these pins, and then digital write high and low as needed, low being ground, high being 3 volts. What I also do here in the setup is I set the sensitivity of the touch read function. I'm not going to get into too much detail about that because I covered it in some other videos. Then in the loop itself, I just have this for loop here, where I read all of the individual capacitive sensors using this function here, and then I print them all to serial. So let's try and upload that. That seems to work fine. Let's try and open the serial monitor. And indeed we have 16 different outputs here. They all look to be roughly similar values, which is a good thing. And I can see that these 4 plucking or strumming sensors here are the first 4 in the array. And then these other 12 sensors here represent the rest of the array. And I can see that all of them have a pretty low resolution of between 20 and 50 points. But that's okay, I'm not going to have any volume control on this instrument. I just need to register whether the sensor is active or not. And that indeed seems to be quite possible with these sensor readings. So let's try and close this down and move on to the next file. Here is the second file. And it really doesn't get much more complicated than the previous one. I introduced 2 new arrays here. One is the threshold array, where I have an individual threshold value for each sensor, which was handpicked by myself. And then I have a separate array where I keep track of whether or not the sensor has passed that threshold. So then the setup section here is the same as before, but now in my for loop I read all the individual sensors and then I compare them to the threshold values for that position. If they're over the threshold, then the sensor active array value is 1. If not, then it's 0. And then I print that sensor active value. So I'm going to have a readout of 1s and 0s, signifying each sensor being active or not. So let's try and upload that. Nice. Let's open the serial monitor. Okay. And indeed we're getting a bunch of 0 readouts. So now I should be able to activate these sensors individually. Indeed, that's the first one, second one, third and fourth. All 4 of them together. That's the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. And they can be activated individually or together in groups. Nice, that works great. Let's close that down and check out the next file. And so here's the third file. As you can see, I've introduced a couple of new arrays here. One holds the individual minimum reading values for all of the sensors, and then we have the common maximum value for all of them. And then we have these 2 arrays here which keep track of the current sensor readings and the previous sensor readings so that we can compare and see if there's any change. Setup is the same as before. And then we have these 2 new functions here, which is basically for the exponential filter, which I use to smooth out the readings so I get a less jittery end result. I've used these functions in many other Kontrol Freak projects, so I'm not going to get into too much detail here. Then in the main for loop, this time what I do is I first keep track of the previous sensor readings, and then I read a new reading into a temporary value. Then I map it between 0 and 127. Then I use that temporary value to put through the exponential filter, and so that I can get a smoother result of the reading. And then I map it to a binary value of whether or not it crosses the threshold value for each individual sensor, and then I print that active status to the serial. So let's try and upload that. Nice. Let's open the serial monitor. So as you can see, we're still getting a 0 reading from all the sensors, which is correct. We're looking for a binary value here. But now the result is passed through the exponential filter, and so it should be more stable, meaning that I won't get results where the sensor continuously jumps back and forth between 1 and 0. So this looks to be working quite well. So let's try and close that down and open up the 4th and final file. So starting from the top, we're still defining the same pins for the multiplexer. We're defining the same arrays for the sensor readings. But now we have a last sensor active value. So now we're keeping track both of the last sensor reading, but also whether or not the sensor was active last time. This might seem mysterious, but really the last sensor reading is something that I use to put through the exponential filter so that I can get a smooth result, and then the last sensor active value I use to define whether or not I should output a note. Then of course, as always, when we want to output MIDI notes, we need to have some MIDI note values, and those are these numbers here, and these are called org note values. These are the original notes, so that's what sounds if you play these strings without touching this part of the interface here. And then down below we have the actual note values, which is the final output note value after incorporating what is going on in this part of the instrument. So in the main loop here is where most of the new stuff is going on. But we start the same as before. We keep track of the last sensor readings, and then we keep track of the last sensor active status for each sensor. Then we make a new reading, we map it to MIDI range, then we put it through the filter, and then we map it down to this binary value of on or off. Then I serial print as before, just to be able to troubleshoot the code. So although that for loop is pretty much the same as before, then after it I have another one here with 4 positions. So each position of this for loop counts for one of the strings. First thing I do for each string is I check the uppermost sensor closest to the strumming section here. So first I read this position, and if that's not active then I read this position, and if that's not active then I read this position, and if that's not active then I will output the original note value that you saw in the array further up. So that's what's going on here. If the sensor active at I plus 12 is equal to 1, that's if this sensor here is active. Then we add 3 to the original note value, and so we add 1, 2, 3 semitones to that note value. And then we do the same thing for the other sensor position here. We do the same thing for this sensor right here, and then we do the same thing for all of the 4 strings and the sensors that go with them. So then the last thing we do in this part down here is we keep track of sensors that were active in the last loop and are now inactive, meaning that you have just plucked your finger off the string. And if one of those sensors is in that state, then we send out a MIDI note with the MIDI note value in question, full velocity to channel 1. And if a sensor was previously inactive but now it's active, then we send a note with a velocity value of 0, meaning a note off to that string. That's because if you put your finger on a string instrument, then you actually dampen the note, and so it stops sounding. So that's the whole interface in a nutshell. Let's try and upload that and see how that works. Cool, let's try and open the serial monitor. Okay, so keep in mind that I didn't change the serial output here at all, so we're still just going to get the same on-off output as in the previous file. But of course, what I did include now is a MIDI output, and so we're going to have to open up the synthesizer to see if that actually worked. But so far so good. Let's open the synthesizer and see if we can make some noise. Excellent, here we are. So as always, I'm running the Yoshimi synthesizer through jack, and I just connect it like this here. Nice. And the patch that I've selected is this patch here. It's called Clean Guitar. It's just one of the original patches that comes with Yoshimi, and it's quite a nice guitar patch. And so that's really all we need, and the MIDI ukulele should now be fully functional. So let's just try the strings first and see how that goes. Ooh, that works. So it's a little bit hard to plug the individual strings, but strumming works just great. Okay, so now to select individual notes, I should be able to do it down here. Let's just try one string first and see how that goes. Yeah. Nice. How about 2 strings? Okay, and separately. So let's try a whole chord. Man, that's so nice. So the tuning of these strings here is something that I got from one of my friends who plays the guitar and the ukulele, and he told me that the tuning is like the 4 lower strings of the guitar, but this one is raised an octave. So it really feels kind of like a guitar when I hold it like this. Of course, I'm not a guitar player, so that probably just sounds stupid, but it's really kind of the same setup here, or I should say a ukulele, because it only has 4 strings. And the response is really nice.